In the midst of an increasingly insecure geopolitical environment, pacifist Japan is shedding its post-Second World War military taboos. The government is spending a record amount on defense, is lifting restrictions on arms exports, and for the first time ever this month took on a combat role in a joint military exercise in the Philippines. So in this video, we're going to explain Japan's defense buildup, what's behind it, and how the world is responding. The next issue of our magazine is out very soon, with this issue focusing on all of the wars that Trump has been involved in during his second term, with each dot on the cover representing a different military intervention or strike. Inside, we run through each of the conflicts, from Venezuela and Iran to Yemen and Ecuador, as well as discussing what he's really doing. Pre-order your copy today at toolong.news. After its defeat in the Second World War, Japan, in its 1947 constitution, renounced war and the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes, and committed not to maintain war potential. This has been a bedrock of Japan's enduring post-war pacifism, which has become a part of the country's identity. Japan does, of course, have its self-defense forces, which functions as a de facto military, but which is constitutionally and legally constrained in its functions. Restrictions on arms exports were introduced in 1967 and tightened in 1976 to ban virtually all arms exports. So through the subsequent decades, Japan's defense industry was effectively shut off from the global market, with only really one customer: the self-defense forces. However, there has been a gradual erosion of these rules over the past decade or so, beginning under then-PM Shinzo Abe, who sought to loosen Japan's pacifist constraints and normalize its military capabilities. Most notably, in 2015, Abe's government reinterpreted the constitution to allow Japan to exercise the right to collective self-defense and deploy its forces in support of an allied country under attack. A year prior, Abe weakened the prohibition on military exports by allowing exports in 5 non-lethal categories: rescue, transport, vigilance, surveillance, and minesweeping. But it's in the last few years that we've seen the fastest shift in Japan's defense posture. Before we get into the exact changes, particularly the ones under Takaichi, we should explain why Japan is undergoing this profound shift. The Japanese government's 2022 national security strategy describes the current moment as the most severe and complex security environment since the end of World War II, a reality that makes strengthening Japanese military capabilities a necessity, according to then Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. In Japan's neighborhood, China is obviously the greatest cause for concern among US allies. Its desire to reunify Taiwan with the mainland, and refusal to rule out using military force to do so, has raised the spectre of a potential invasion. Similarly, China is engaged in confrontation with the likes of the Philippines over disputed territory in the South China Sea. Elsewhere, an increasingly assertive North Korea is continuing its nuclear program and demonstrating its fighting capabilities with missile tests and military parades. It's worth remembering too that Russia is also an Asia-Pacific power, has deepened its ties with China and North Korea over recent years, and semi-regularly tests Japanese airspace with warplanes. Against this backdrop, the commitment of the United States to the region's security is increasingly in doubt under Donald Trump, who is pushing the US's Asian allies to shoulder more of the burden for their own defense. So, what has Japan actually done over the past few years to address all of this? Well, in 2022, then PM Kishida launched a 5-year plan to double defense spending to 2% of GDP, a move that, according to some estimates, puts Japan on course to become the world's 3rd largest defense spender behind the US and China. As part of this surge, he oversaw the ordering of 400 Tomahawk cruise missiles from the US to boost Japan's counter-strike capability. In 2024, his government then further loosened export restrictions by allowing the export of finished defense equipment manufactured in Japan under foreign license to the countries that hold said licenses. Now led by Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, the Japanese government announced last month that it was abolishing the 5 categories restricting defense exports. Put simply, defense exports will now be categorized as either non-lethal equipment, like radar and protective gear with no export limitations, and lethal equipment, like missiles, tanks, warships, and jets, which Japan will be able to sell to the 17 countries with which it has transfer agreements, although a ban on exports to conflict zones, other than in exceptional circumstances, will remain. This is a big deal, not least for Japan's defense contractors such as Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Kawasaki Heavy Industries, which will soon be opened up to a global pool of prospective customers. Countries across the world are seeking not just to boost their military capabilities, but also diversify their arms. And Japanese defense hardware is clearly already in demand. Under the previous export rules, Japan recently signed a joint development and production agreement with Australia to supply the Australian Navy with 11 Mogami-class frigates. And under the new rules, Japan is in talks with the Philippines to export used Japanese warships to the country. As we mentioned earlier, Japan just took up its first ever combat role in joint military exercises in the Philippines, having previously just been an observer. This forms part of Japan's expanding security presence in the region, which has seen it enhance defense cooperation, particularly with the Philippines, which, like Japan, Taiwan, and Malaysia, forms part of the so-called First Island Chain, a strategic line of archipelagos viewed by the US as essential to containing China. Japan has also deepened its security cooperation with Indonesia, the ASEAN bloc as a whole, and Australia. This push to make Japan a key security player in the region through a defense boost and building of a lattice work of security alliances is pretty remarkable given that Japan's post-war pacifism was meant to reassure its neighbours who had been victims of its imperial aggression. Today's military buildup has unsurprisingly been condemned by China, North Korea, and Russia, with the Chinese government warning that Japanese militarism must never be allowed to resurface. However, the fact is that the international community is far more receptive to Japan boosting its military than it would have been decades ago. Culturally speaking, generations that associate Japan with wartime atrocities and imperialism are giving way to younger generations, more familiar with the modern Japan of technology, anime, and matcha. In terms of global security and geopolitics, for some past victims of Japanese aggression, like the Philippines, Japan's military buildup is seen less as an old threat re-emerging and more as a crucial bulwark against the new Chinese threat. In South Korea, the government has stayed relatively quiet on Japan's defense buildup, reflecting the fact that despite unresolved historic issues, like the Japanese military's use of sexual slavery during its occupation years, it recognizes the importance of Japan's position in the regional security architecture, and the value of cooperation with Japan as a deterrent against the likes of North Korea and China. Inside Japan, there is some domestic opposition to any move away from the country's post-war pacifism, particularly amending Article 9 of the Constitution, which Takaichi wants to open a debate on. Just last week, Japan saw its largest ever protest in support of its pacifist constitution. However, off the back of a huge election victory earlier this year, it's unlikely that Japan's rearmament and defense shift will slow down anytime soon. There's much more to discuss here though, with this being just one example of Trump's international influence and escapades. As I mentioned, the next issue of our magazine, Too Long, is out very soon, where we dive much deeper into all of these conflicts. And if you've stuck around this long, you're probably interested to hear more of our thoughts. Plus, if you subscribe using promo code SUMMER26 at checkout, you'll get 20% off every copy as long as you stay subscribed, plus an additional £3 off your first copy. It's not just Trump's wars and conflicts either. The summer issue of Too Long contains news from each region, including pieces from elections around the world, including the UK, Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovenia, and Denmark. A piece on whether we're heading into a new world war, the Euro's missing members, an update on what's happened following the Gen Z protests of last year, as well as a rundown of Trump's continued threats towards Greenland. Speaking of Greenland, if you didn't already know, we visited Greenland to film a series called What's the Big Deal with Greenland? While we were there, we explored the vast, impenetrable country, camped out on a glacier, and drove to the US's abandoned military bases. The first episode will be out very soon, with all episodes exclusively available to TLDR Party members. You can learn more about TLDR Party by clicking the link in the description, but the cheapest way to sign up is in a bundle with Too Long. So if you're going to subscribe to the latest issue of the magazine, then consider grabbing yourself a TLDR Party membership at the same time. Find out more about both at toolong.news.